Okay, honors biologists, this is the beginning of 8.2 in your notes, solar energy capture, and we're starting at pigments and photosynthesis. So on wavelengths of light, when we look at all the energy coming towards us, we mostly focus on the visible light. Take a look at the whole electromagnetic spectrum. The smaller the wavelength, the more energy it has. So we can see gamma rays down there at the smallest on our EM spectrum, then X-rays and UV rays, and then pigments are right here in the middle. And then to a lesser degree, they have less energy the larger the wavelength. Within the visible light, we can see all the different colors. Purple and blue have a smaller wavelength, whereas red has a larger wavelength. But when all of those wavelengths come in together, it appears just as white light to us. But if you use a prism, you can separate out those different wavelengths of light. And we'll put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it. If you take a leaf, very poorly drawn leaf, okay, there are basically three options when that light comes in. One, that light energy could be absorbed and used. And the thing that's going to be doing the absorbing are pigments. A second option that can happen is it can be transmitted, so that light could just pass through that leaf. And the third option would be that it could be reflected, so the light could come in and reflect back out. Well, as far as we're concerned, whatever light doesn't get absorbed, that's the light that is going to be reflected back to us, whatever we don't use. And for us, since most leaves appear green, it's the green light that is reflected back towards our eyes, because that wavelength of light is not used as readily as some of the other wavelengths of light to power photosynthesis. So let's take a picture of this, or let's look at that a little bit more. So we're looking at the whole visible spectrum, and I wanted you to see the increasing, the larger the wavelengths, the less the energy. But this right here is called an absorption spectrum. And when we look at the different wavelengths, so for instance, if we look at chlorophyll A, okay, it absorbs in this realm primarily, these purples and blues, and then I'm over here, right here at chlorophyll A, and up here in the reds and the oranges, whereas chlorophyll B is just inside of that, okay, a little bit more blue here, and a little more yellow here. A different pigment are carotenoids, and hopefully you're thinking carrots, and carrots are orange. And the reason is the carotenoids, they can absorb the colors down here. And since they can't, you can see right here, but they can't absorb the reds and the yellows, and that's why carrots appear orange, is because they're reflecting that wavelength back to us. So on your notes, you have pigments and photosynthesis. Light is either absorbed, transmitted, or reflected. Number 2 is the absorption spectrum. It's a graph of the percent of light absorbed at each wavelength by each pigment. And we are primarily going to focus on chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. A photosystem is where it all starts. There are pigment complexes, several pigments, electron acceptor molecules within the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. So remember, they look like green pancakes in the middle of your chloroplast. That's where the pigments are embedded. That's who's going to be absorbing these different wavelengths of energy. So in the fall, like we are in right now, we can see that leaves are starting to take on different colors, some of the oranges and the greens. And you had an additional objective on that last chapter. Partly it has to do with chlorophyll itself, that pigment breaking down. Also the backup of glucose within the leaf and how that impacts the biochemistry of the leaf. And you start to see some of these other pigments instead. Ones that are reflecting back red and ones that are reflecting back these yellows. Coming next to the equation for photosynthesis, we have talked about this. All of these wavelengths that we're discussing, this energy is coming from the sun in order to power this entire reaction. And remember, we talked about that CO2 is going to be reduced into glucose. that reaction will be step 2 right here. This is going to be called the Calvin cycle when that happens. And that's going to be part 2 of photosynthesis. And then we have where water, right here, at the very beginning we're going to split water and we're going to temporarily give those hydrogens to NADP in order to reduce it. And when we split water like that, we will be releasing oxygen, and that's going to happen in part 1, and that is called photophosphorylation. And I ran out of room, so sorry. Photophosphorylation. So take a look at your notes. You have the overall equation. The role of NADP is to temporarily, it will hold electrons from water, and they are given to NADP, and then ultimately you're going to take those electrons that are here given to NADP, and they're going to be given to carbon dioxide in order to build glucose. So they were at water, given to NADP, and then they're going to be given to CO2 in order to build that glucose. So there are 2 reactions, one called the light-dependent reaction, and in this reaction, up here identified as the light reaction, the light-dependent reaction, water is going to be split, and light energy is used, and NADPH, ATP, and oxygen are formed. So water will be split in the light reaction. As a result of water getting split, oxygen is produced. The hydrogens that are in water are going to ultimately be given to NADP to reduce it. And then those electrons will be used in part 2 in the Calvin cycle. And also during the light reaction, you're going to generate quite a bit of ATP in order to power this endergonic reaction of the Calvin cycle. And another name for the Calvin cycle is the light independent reaction. This is the light independent reaction, and where we have the light dependent reaction above. Now, just like we had our Krebs cycle and it happened 2 times, we're going to look at the Calvin cycle happening 2 times with an end product being sugar. And it's here in this Calvin cycle that we're going to bring in CO2, and CO2 is going to receive these hydrogens in order to build our sugar molecule. So number 2, the Calvin cycle / light independent reaction, and an old school name for that is dark reaction, is using ATP and reduced NADP from the light dependent reaction to reduce CO2 into glucose / carbohydrates. To reduce CO2 into glucose / carbohydrates. And we'll take a pause right there.